What's going on, beautiful people? Hello, my name is Brian, and I'm one of the pastors at Calvary Chapel, Melbourne. We are in the middle of this series called Grace Changes Everything. It is a verse-by-verse study of the book of Galatians. And I wanted to record a couple of videos to tell you some of the background information to Galatians. This is not going to be a teaching. In a teaching, we're really trying to pull out application points. We're trying to create something that relates to every single person wherever you're at in your walk with God. This is more of a nerdy deep dive. And the goal of this is that if you want to watch these, it will help you as you read through the Bible, especially as you read through Acts and any of Paul's letters, any of the other letters, Romans, all the way through Revelation. But especially as you read through Galatians or even as you're listening to Galatians, this is really going to help you. The topic or the title of this video is who are the type of people that you would meet when you are walking around in the ancient Middle East. So if you were around at the time of Paul, if you were in Galatia, if you were in Judea, if you were in Antioch, like all of these places, what would it look like to walk around and see the people who are there? And again, this is really important because Paul is writing this letter to people. And so he's actually addressing a group of people, a church. And so what did that church look like? And I want to point out or highlight a couple of things. Really, I think you could put the type of people walking around into three general buckets. And I'm sure that I'm not a historian, I'm not a scholar, I'm sure scholars would put them in different buckets, but if you can imagine this, that there's three buckets of people that you could put people in. And the first bucket is Gentiles. And so this would be people who were Roman citizens who had a lot of power. This could be people who had land and were very wealthy, or people who were married to people who had land and very wealthy. But this could also be people who were slaves, who were very poor. They're all along the socio-economic spectrum and things like that. But like the Gentile people, most of them were pagan. Most of them worshipped a variety of different gods. Certainly a worship of the emperor was in there, where they would worship Caesar as being Lord and King, but they really had a variety of different gods that they worship. And then the second bucket is Hellenistic Jews. Now, let me explain that. So obviously God's chosen people, the Jews, they were in the land of Israel. But then when the Babylonians came and when a bunch of other things happened before Jesus, they were spread out all throughout the known world and all throughout the Roman Empire. So there were thousands and thousands and thousands of Jews all over the place. In Europe, in Turkey, in the Middle East, like all over. And so most big cities that you went to, there was a population of Jews that were there. And so there were kind of two types of Jews, and that's the other two buckets that we could talk about. One bucket would be like what would be called the Hellenistic Jews. And Hellenistic Jews were those Jews who were not as devout as the other group of Jews that I'm going to talk about in a minute, but they were really Jews that had kind of like become, in some sense, Greek. And so they were Jews because they were Jews by birth, but in a lot of ways, they had adopted the Greek culture, the Greek tradition, and I'm sure that they had varying ranges of like being dedicated to worshiping God, being dedicated to the Hebrew scriptures or not. And you can think about it like this, that in our day and age, there are people who would say to themselves, like, I am a devout Christian. I go to church every single day. I go to church every single week. Like, I am dedicated, I'm locked in. And then there are people who would say, yeah, I'm a Christian. I go Christmas, I go Easter, or my parents were Christian, and so I identify myself as being Christian. You can think about that group as the Hellenistic Jews. And then there's this third bucket. So first bucket is Gentiles, all sorts of Gentiles, rich, poor, all this. The second bucket, Hellenistic Jews, which would be Jews, but they looked a lot like the culture around them. And then the third bucket would be called devout Jews. And let me tell you a little bit about devout Jews. Okay, so devout Jews were those who had a very strict adherence to the law, a strict adherence to the Torah. And the reason was this: God had promised the people that he was going to save Israel. he was going to send a Messiah. He was going to eradicate Israel's enemies. He was going to bring the people back to their land. Well, these devout Jews, many of them believed that the reason that God had not yet saved Israel was because the Jewish people in general were compromised, that they had worshipped other gods, or that they were too interested in integrating with the culture around them and not as devoted and dedicated as they needed to be to the Torah and to the law of God. And if you're thinking about it critically, you're probably seeing there's a little bit of a conflict brewing between Hellenistic Jews who were kind of like, you know what, it's cool if God comes back, that's awesome, but really I'm just living my life. And then these devout Jews who are like, we have to adhere to the law of God. And really the Hellenistic Jews were kind of viewed as a problem or as an issue because they were viewed as almost having compromised their beliefs. Now, Paul, who wrote the book of Galatians, he was a zealous Jew. He was a devout Jew. And in fact, he says that he had a lot of zeal. In Philippians, he said, as to zeal, a Pharisee. He was one of the most zealous Jews when it came to the law. There's a story in the Old Testament about a man named Phineas. And Phineas was around during the time when the children of Israel were wandering the desert. And during this time, they actually, the people of Israel, walked away from God and they compromised. And the reason they compromised was because a man took a wife who was not from Israel. That was not allowed. And in fact, he slept with her, and there was this whole thing where the people of Israel allowed it, and they were celebrating it, and that was like against the law. And because of that, a huge plague broke out. Now, Phineas, this is very, very intense, I'll warn you. Phineas takes a spear and he kills the man and his wife. And what he's doing is he's saying, like, look, everyone else around me is actually like compromising. I'm not going to compromise. I'm going to eradicate evil. And he was called zealous because of that. So the reason I tell you that story is Paul, he also used the word zealous. He's like, I am a zealous Jew. I am passionate about the purity of the law of God and keeping to the law of God. This probably makes sense as you think about Paul's earlier life as Saul. He was so passionate and so zealous that he actually was killing Christians and trying to wipe them out because he felt like they represented a compromise to the law of God. And because they represented a compromise to the law of God, they were really preventing God's plans from moving forward and preventing God from saving Israel. Now, why is this important for me to share this? Well, there was no such thing as a private life in the ancient world. When we have a relatively private lives, we can go into our driveways, we can close our garage doors, we can hide, we have fences, so we have a very private life. We have a segmented life. You didn't have a private life if you lived in Jerusalem, if you lived in Antioch. You probably lived with 10 people in a house that was the size of most people's bedrooms. Houses were packed together, so if you made a decision, it affected everybody around you. If you were a devout Jew and you decided, I'm not going to be a Jew anymore, I am going to become a Hellenistic Jew, or I'm going to renounce my faith. Well, if you started hanging out with Gentiles, that was a big deal because the people that you lived with believed that you were unclean, and so it created huge conflict, huge division. And now you could also see perhaps some of the reason why the Pharisees were so passionate about killing Jesus, and why later the Jewish leaders were so passionate about stopping Paul and stopping the rise of Christianity, because they felt like this represented a compromise to the Jewish faith. Now, we know that it's not a compromise, it's actually a completion of the Jewish faith, but that's not how they saw it at the time. And so, once again, you could also see that when a group of Christians, when Paul goes and he plants a church, a group of people start getting saved and they start meeting together from church, it really has a huge effect, because you have people who grew up Gentile and they have really no framework for this. You have people who are Hellenistic who are like, I'm cool, sort of cool with kind of allowing some of both cultures. And then you have these people who grew up extremely devout. Now they're all together under one roof, worshiping, all of them having a specific worldview, all of them having a specific belief for how things should go. This will create a lot of conflict which is the reason for a lot of the letters that Paul wrote. So that's a little bit of the background of the type of people that you would find in the ancient world, the type of people that probably made up the church of Galatia. So I hope that's helpful for you. I'll record a couple more videos to talk about Paul's history, as well as to talk about a little bit more of the background for why Galatians was written. Hope these are helpful. Blessings.